Um, we're going to get started here, and I was asked to address the safety responsibilities for program managers who are managing water quality monitoring programs. Going to cover the regulatory drivers behind the health and safety responsibilities for managing programs. Regardless of whether you're supervising or managing these projects with either paid staff or volunteers, there's still certain requirements that must be met. In this slide, you're going to talk about these three specific regulations. First off, the Hazard Communication Standard, which has also become famous as the Employee Right to Know legislation. The standard requires that each employer inform their employees of hazards that they are exposed to or that they use in the workspace through the use of material safety data sheets and other training methods. By the way, the Employee Right to Know legislation was followed by the Community Right to Know legislation in 1986. This program should be in writing. The only time it's not required to be in writing is if you have 10 or fewer employees. Also, this legislation is based on federal requirements, so it's not something unique to the state of California. Since the state of California has its own state-run program, they have to adopt either in whole or at least equivalent to the federal legislation. So the Hazard Communication Standard started off as a federal regulation. So it applies to every state. Next, we have the Injury and Illness Prevention Program. We call it the IIPP regulation. And what this regulation requires is that the employers have to train their employees in the hazards unique to their job assignments prior to exposure to this hazard. What this means is that you need to know what your workforce will be doing in the course of their job assignment. You have to identify the hazard associated with the tasks that they're going to perform, and you have to ensure that they are trained and equipped to perform those tasks prior to them going out and doing the work. Now, how does it pertain to volunteers? Volunteers are protected under the regulation as well. There should be a written program that identifies these things as well as a verbal training program. That way, regardless of whether the employer is actually present at the workplace or not, the program still exists and the employee can review it, or the volunteer or the student. The regulation we'll look at here quickly is the Hazardous Waste Operations and Emergency Response. We call it HAZWOPER for short. The HAZWOPER regulation also followed in 1986 and was unique because this regulation lumped several freestanding regulations into one to address items like planning, training, the use of personal protective equipment, and emergency response, and some other things together, and it pertained to specific sites. One, mandatory cleanup of hazardous substances, substance removal required by a state, local, or federal agency. 2, corrective actions involving hazardous waste cleanup at RCRA sites. 3, operations involving hazardous waste at TSD facilities or operations, that's treatment, storage, or disposal sites. 4 was voluntary cleanup at sites recognized as controlled hazardous waste sites. And 5, emergency response operations for the release of hazardous substances with regard to the location. So if you have any project that falls in those 5 categories, then your volunteers or employees will have to have HAZWOPER training. These 3 regulations should be incorporated in your policies and procedures or guidelines, or however you have your document, whether it's a planning document, so that your employees always have access to them. Requirements. Written plans will identify their job tasks, and training is provided for these tasks. That's your main goal. Make sure that all the workers have been trained on their tasks. Don't assign duties or tasks to people who cannot perform them because they lack either training, equipment, or knowledge. You really need to ensure that they know what they're doing. You should let the written program or the procedure identify what is to be performed. Of course, you're going to teach them, demonstrate to them what to do, but really there should be a written element to it. You can evaluate the written procedure to make sure that it's current and that it addresses all the tasks. Someone brings point to you that it's not covered in the written program, you can always amend the written program to include it. Also have a list of prohibited tasks. If things that people should not be doing, identify those as well. Now, if you have a supervisor directing the work in lieu of a written procedure, that person takes on a liability if something goes wrong and the worker is injured or if they become ill, especially if it's in conflict with the written procedure. If there's something else that's needed in the written program, amend it or update it. Having a written procedure that people are following will remove personal liability. Now, the employer or the owner still has that liability, but it removes personal liability from a person who's supervising. If people provide their own personal protective equipment, you have to make sure that it works for what it's being used for. If you have them working in a dusty environment or an environment with pollens, they might want to wear a nuisance dust mask. You don't have to have an exposure to wear a dust mask because it's not for exposure conditions. But it's got to be an approved respirator dust mask, which means it has to have 2 straps instead of 1. Okay, so you need to know what is approved equipment. Bandana is not approved equipment. If they really don't need anything out there, but they're comfortable with the bandana, offer them the use of a dust mask. When you become aware of problems, you have to make sure that they're fixed. If you have complaints, you need to investigate them. If you find someone isn't doing what they should do, fix the problem or get personnel who will do what you're asking. And make sure you keep records of who's been trained, what they've been trained on. Okay, Assembly Bill 1127. This is a unique piece of legislation that was passed a number of years ago. We also identify it as the Cal OSHA Reform Act. Assembly Bill 1127 did was it redefined work sites, work representative. It defined who can complain about a hazardous situation. It beefed serious violations and the penalty structure for violations. So one of the things you see there in the slide, it says it removes civil penalty exemptions for government and educational agencies for violations of Cal OSHA regulations. Well, back in the day, if you were a governmental agency or an educational agency, you could be cited by OSHA, but you couldn't be fined. Well, that civil penalty exemption has now been removed because of Assembly Bill 1127. So under this act, almost anyone can file a complaint about a workplace hazard. They only need to be knowledgeable about the workplace or the tasks that are being performed, and they have to have some indicator as to why it's hazardous. So it's important that the people you have working on your projects, it's in that they identify what an unsafe condition is, so they can either bring it to someone's attention and have it corrected, or so that they can avoid it. If a person is working in conditions that they feel are unsafe, and they go home and they talk to their spouse or maybe they're volunteering and they have a real job that they get paid for somewhere else, and they complain to an employee there. That person who's knowledgeable about the work that they're doing in this project can then call OSHA and file a complaint. OSHA will then come out, do an investigation. If they feel that there are violated conditions, you can be cited. The definition of serious violations was also expanded to include the probability that death or serious physical harm will result if a violation occurred and there were exposure to the violated conditions. So you don't actually have to have exposed the violated condition, just the probability that if violation exists and there was exposure to it, that death or serious physical harm would result. Again, if you're aware of a condition, say that there's a confined space at a location and that if anyone were in there, they could drown, or there may be oxygen deficiency, and you didn't notify people that condition, and followed by, of course, they're prohibited to enter that space. If they have knowledge of that, then you could be in trouble. So you have to make sure they're knowledgeable about it and that it's identified as as an off-limits work area. If they enter that space themselves, then that would be a volunteer condition. You would be off the hook for an OSHA violation, but you don't want someone to be injured. Okay. This is important because not only does a new serious violation pack a big financial punch, it's more likely that your workers can be in harm's way. So remember, if they are working in conditions that they didn't create when they're out there on some of these projects. These conditions were created by someone else or something else, maybe Mother Nature. So you want them to stay out of harm's way. Make sure you're knowledgeable about the site before you send them out there. Penalty structure. Now, this pertains to all work sites and all violations. So it doesn't matter if it's in an industrial facility or a park. If there's a violation there, this could be the penalty. Penalties were increased under this Reform Act. Not only were they, again, increased for governmental and educational agencies, but they're no longer exempt from penalties. Any violation has the potential for carrying a monetary penalty. Before the penalty structure was renewed by OSHA, could only get a penalty if you had more than 10 general violations. Now, one general violation can pack a penalty. How does AB 1127 affect you? Since your workforce are working on sites controlled by others, those sites are now known as multi-employer work sites, and all employers present are subject to investigation, citation, and penalty when their employees are exposed to violated conditions. So if your workforce is performing work, they'll be trained and knowledgeable about hazard recognition, evaluating those hazards, and determining some control measure. They also need to be knowledgeable about avoiding non-compliant conditions. All of these sites should have someone who's knowledgeable about health and safety. If you have someone whose specific responsibility is health and safety, then the workers need to each be their own health and safety person. Around conditions that they don't create can still put them in harm's way and can still make you liable for a violation. Where do you need to go to get more information? Internet is a very good resource, and here I've listed a couple of web addresses for Cal OSHA, the Centers for Disease Control, and the U.S. Department of Labor. Now, you can browse these sites for information, and you can use that information for training. You can use it to develop guidelines or fact sheets. They're very good sites, very easy to use as well. And when you develop procedures, make sure that you list responsibilities for your workers and for your organization. Um, Identify someone who is going to be responsible for training, responsible for providing or evaluating personal protective equipment, and providing health and safety guidance. Hopefully, you'll find that looking at these websites will present a good opportunity to do some volunteer and worker training. Show your workforce that you're indeed interested in their health and safety. In summary, looked at project manager responsibilities, knowing what is required for managing a project in terms of health and safety. And I really think that this will make your job easier and will help get and keep your workforce safe while they're out there working. Again, regardless of whether these are paid staff or volunteers, they need to be protected. If you have any questions, you can either send me an email. I've listed my email address here, or you can contact Eric, and you have his email address and phone number. At this time, you can undelete your phone, and I believe that is *6 to undelete. If you have a question, I see that no one texted in a question through the chat, but if you have a question, just go ahead. I just give me your first name and ask away.
Thanks.
Karen?
I can.
Sure, go ahead.
This is Pavlova, Cynthia.
Hi.
I was wondering, oftentimes when we use volunteers, we have them sign these waivers, so that they won't be held liable in case they get injured. Will there be any weight?
Well, yes and no. There's always liability, especially if someone, again, is instructing them on what to do and they follow the instructions and they get injured. There's personal liability on behalf of the person who told them what it is they wanted them to do. So, yes, there is liability. Sometimes it'll depend on the nature of the injury or the nature of the work. And that's why you really need to assume that there's the possibility that you can be sued, that you can be held liable.
We do a HEP?
Well, and the HEP that Pavlova just mentioned is called a hazard evaluation plan. And what that does is that you can either do that or you can do a job safety analysis, and it identifies exactly what people are going to be doing and what the hazard is associated with it and how you go about correcting that hazard. You're looking at everything from lifting, from heat stress, from falling in a creek that's covered with algae and possibility of getting conjunctivitis, slip, trip, and fall, a number of things, and just make sure that they're trained in the hazard and that you provide protective measures. In terms of how credible your liability and hold harmless clause is, you'll have to ask an attorney. Karen? Karen, I see this thing. It looks like a hand raised signal, so that's why I'm calling on Karen. Karen, if you're not unmuted, you'll have to unmute your phone so I can hear you. Okay, someone's talking, and all I heard was "so you're saying," and you'll have to speak up or speak into your mic or your phone. Okay, for some reason my mute isn't working out. Can you tell us where to access this presentation? Eric, you can cover that because it's being recorded and you're going to post it somewhere.
posted on the net web page. I'll give you the slide for that. Just give me a second here.
Yeah, you unmuted with star 6, by the way, if you guys are not did that.
The screen, if you take a look at the bottom, it's shaded in blue. That URL for where we place all of the announcements, as well as material and recording links.
Karen, did you get that? Okay, great.
So.
Yes, she did. Any other questions? Don't be intimidated by this information. It really isn't scary. The big thing you need to know is identify the hazards, and you can almost do this along with your technical plan. Each portion of your technical plan says you're taking water samples. Identify that in writing and identify when you're taking water samples. Anytime you deal with a liquid, you have a splash hazard, so you should wear eye protection and gloves. If you're on a slope, there's the potential of someone falling down the slope. Is there some other way to get in there, or do you just really need to take precaution? People on the hazards, and don't forget those. Don't teach them separately from the technical portions, but teach them together. Because if you tell them to take samples, and then at the end you say, oh yeah, that's right, put on glasses, what they'll end up doing is taking the sample and then go, oh, I forgot my glasses. So you have to teach the two things together. So that's it, and there's no other questions. I'll turn it back over to